Hey everyone, I hope you're all doing well today. This time we are going to be looking at James Rolfe's book, A Movie Making Nerd. This is a pretty interesting book. I think James has a very, very interesting story to tell. And yes, some of this stuff was pretty good, and others I felt like I had heard it before in some of his videos. So James has had a pretty fascinating life, just from reading through this book and from hearing some of the stories that he's shared with us on his YouTube channel. It's a pretty cool one, and it's fascinating just to see how he was able to turn his hobby into sort of his profession, and how he always tried to just improve on his hobby as he went along. Most of this book has to deal with making movies, or making like short films or something like that. There isn't a whole lot that has to do with AVGN, especially early on, but later on he gets into talking about his movie and the experience with making the movie, that sort of thing. That's sort of the big part in all of this. He does talk about, his childhood, his childhood, and then he talks about his college years and some of the troubles that he had throughout that period of his life. It's pretty interesting to read. Some of these stories I had never heard before. I've only really been following him since about 2015 or so I didn't really know a whole lot about what he had done prior to AVGN, or know a whole lot about his life prior to that. And yeah, I'm one of those people that didn't really feel like digging into his life too much. I don't really join a whole lot of online communities, so I don't follow all the ins and outs of the channel or anything. So hearing some of what goes on behind the scenes that he shares in this book, hearing about how he met some of the people that were involved with the channel early on, I thought that was pretty cool. He doesn't really go into why those people left, which was kind of I understand why he didn't, but it was kind of a shame to not really hear what happened with that, at least from his perspective. And that is something I do want to point out with this book, like many other autobiographies that I've read for this channel. This is only half of the story. We don't get the whole story from everyone, because that's not the point of a book like this. It can be disappointing to some people who want the full story and want to hear what everyone has to say, but that's not the point of the book. That's not the story of this book. It's just a way for James to kind of get his story out there. There were a decent number of stories in this book that I had heard before, mostly through James's videos that he shared over the last several years. That didn't really feel that right to me, because I kind of felt like those, looking back at them now, it felt like those were rough drafts for what this book was going to be. Like he was sort of writing up what he wanted to have in the book, and then eventually he would end up writing those into it. That's all in hindsight, though, so I have no idea really what the point of a lot of that stuff was, aside from sharing a bit of himself with his audience, then, which was fine and everything, but then you come to read his book, and you're hearing a lot of the same stuff that you had already heard before. If you were like me and not following him from all the way back at the beginning and in the early 2000s, then you would not have heard a lot of like the early on childhood stories before. So that was kind of nice to have, but the rest of it felt like we were reading a version of a final draft for what all of those videos were going to be. So yeah, just keep that in mind if you're going to read this. So now we get to the part that makes up a good chunk of the book, and that's really the Angry Video Game Nerd movie. The way he puts it, it sounds very interesting. Hearing the whole premise of the movie, why he did it, his motivations for it, that all sounds really great and everything. I don't remember all the build-up to the movie because I was not really paying attention to YouTube or really the internet at that time, so I didn't know all of the other stuff that went into it. And at times during this, it kind of sounds like he's venting his frustrations with different parts of the movie and with different people online that were kind of critical of the way he was going about making the film. And it sort of speaks to how people don't really know what goes on behind the scenes on making a movie. Most people just see the final product and they either like it or they don't like it, or they fall into like a groupthink of whether the movie is spectacular or horrible based on what they see online and that sort of thing. So yeah, that kind of feels like what happened with this. I remember watching the movie a while after I figured out that it existed. So probably like 2016 or 2017, I watched the movie, didn't really care for it, and just sort of moved on. There were times that I found it entertaining, but I've had no real interest in going back and watching it again. And reading James talk about it, seems like it was a pretty troubled shoot and everything. And I kept thinking about why he shot it where he shot it. And that just kind of seemed a little bit odd. And I wish he had gone more in on why things were done in a certain way. But we don't really get that here. It's kind of a weird part in the book where I appreciate what he's talking about, like the different problems that he had on set, the issues with finding where to shoot, the talk about money, where a lot of it went, and also talking about some of the troubles he had with the people that he was working with. You know, certain people promising specific things and then not really delivering on what they were promised or something along those lines. It really spoke to just how small the budget for the movie was, even though you see how much it is on the Kickstarter, how much money they raised for it, and to an average person, that sounds like a lot of money. But when you're shooting where you are, it dries up pretty quick, and that's kind of what happened. But I do appreciate him talking about just all the struggles with making the film and that sort of thing. So I found that part interesting, but it left me wanting to know more about the film's production and that sort of thing. He then talks a lot about after the movie and everything that, has been going on since then. And it sort of goes by pretty quick. And this is the period that I remember the most about Angry Video Game Nerd. And I wish James had gone into more detail with it. Like, I kind of wanted to know what happened with the podcast, what happened with some of the movie reviews, especially rental reviews. That was the stuff that I was at least hoping to hear a little bit more about, but it just didn't seem to happen. It was fascinating reading about some of the stuff and how he talks about pivoting away from kind of the grind of making videos and that sort of thing. And it seems like he's focusing on other projects and also focusing on his family. He does talk a lot about his family here, and it's really the first place that I've actually heard him talk about it outside of this is what I'm doing more often than not. I'm not really phrasing this properly, but this is what I'm actually focused on, or something along those lines. And here he talks about a lot of the problems that his family's actually gone through over the years, especially when the movie was going to be released, like the last year of development, and then the time after the movie had been released and everything along those lines. And he talks about how he's sort of leaned more on Screenwave and those people to get some of the work done, and how he still does do a lot of, or at least, let me put this right, how he still does work on the videos and everything, but he turns over some of the tasks to kind of Screenwave and other people to do things for him. That makes a lot of sense to me. It, like I said, I'm not as invested in this as some people are. I'm not really super worried about, what goes on behind the scenes at AVGN or at Cinemassacre or really a lot of the other stuff. I was probably hoping for something from this book that was probably not going to be there. And that's okay. It's still a pretty interesting book, the way it's all laid out and everything. And I do like that he talks about certain things in this, especially after the movie came out, when he talks about what he's moving on to. I thought that was kind of fun. He goes into just how certain things were created, his band, which I cannot remember the name of because I'm not as interested in that as I could be. But he also talks about post-COVID stuff and that sort of thing. He does share a little bit more about himself than maybe he wanted to, but yeah, overall it's still kind of a very interesting tale to read, and I feel like there probably could be more in this at some point in time. Now that I've rambled on for probably way too long about certain things, I did like reading this book. It wasn't exactly what I wanted, but I'm not always the target audience for a lot of this stuff. So just looking at what I wanted from something may not actually reflect what his fan base wanted. And it might not represent what he necessarily wanted to give everyone. There are still a number of questions that I have, even after reading this, that probably won't get answered at any point in time. And there's certain answers that I don't necessarily need to know. I'm perfectly happy just not knowing some of them. I will say, James still makes some very good content, makes some very great videos. I do enjoy seeing his name pop up in certain projects, like the David Craddock's Mortal Kombat book, where he wrote one of the forewords for it. It's kind of cool to see just the different things that he pops up in, and it gives you kind of just a different side to what his motivations and what his interests are. It's pretty cool to see it, and yeah. So I did like the book. It's not the best autobiography I've read, and it does kind of leave you wanting a little bit more, but overall, it's still a pretty good book. I also do want to mention, I did not read the Kindle version of this, which, from hearing other people talk about that, it sounds like the Kindle version was an absolute mess. I hope they sorted that out, but I really don't know if they have or not. Anyway, I will talk to you all later. Bye.